Good. It is a blessing to be here. A real privilege to Bryant, to Joel, to the rest of the organizers of this meeting. On behalf of myself and my wife, we're very humbled to be here with you. I want to just make a couple of disclaimers. Some of you have probably seen my wife and I walking around with these objects on our face. I'm guessing you're familiar with them. It's not because we have any problem with this group. We love you dearly. In my line of work, I work for World Vision. I have to be prepared to be deployed at a moment's notice for emergencies. And if I test positive, then I'm stuck for 2 weeks. Most countries around the world still have very careful restrictions. So I'm not worried about catching COVID from you. I'm more worried about being stuck here for 2 weeks. Plus, my wife and I are taking care of her parents who are in France. Her father is 97 and is really towards the end of his life, and we have to be prepared again to hop on a plane at any moment with a call that something may have happened. So please bear with us as we wear our mask. I hope you do understand that. The second disclaimer is a little bit more serious in that when I have been asked to share this story, I always worry that people will think that my wife and I are some kind of spiritual heroes. And I want to say very clearly that we are not. My wife and Ellen and I are very human. We have our foibles. What I can say is we stumble a lot, but we try to stumble forward. That's the direction we try to stumble in as we follow God, as we follow Christ and his leadership on our lives. So we are just like you. We have hopes and fears like anyone else. So this story really is about God's grace, about his leading. And, you know, when you follow the Lord, when you follow Christ, you find that he really gets all the credit. And so if there's any credit here, please let's give it to him. So again, thank you for letting us be here. Over the past 20 plus years, flashed across our TVs and newspapers, if you watch them or read them or whatever way that you get the news, we have seen that the rending of nations and the turmoil of cultures, we've seen reflections of a broken and hurting world in our generation. Many times I just don't want to listen to the radio or don't want to pick up a newspaper because it's so distressing. Things that have happened in our own nation, the school shootings and others. I find it very difficult even to listen and to get the details. The fact is we live in a very hurting and a very broken world. Those of you who are, how do I say this? Either my age or middle-aged or beyond, you probably remember the events of September 11th, when the World Trade Centers collapsed in New York City, when the Pentagon was also hit by a plane. And of course, a little bit more recently, over the last 10 to 20 years, I think we all watched with horror both the atrocities and the suffering that took place in Iraq and then more recently in Syria. And of course, we've also seen these things take place in many other Muslim majority countries around the world. And on a daily basis, even today, we continue to see increasing ideological and cultural disparities and differences, especially between cultures of what we call the East and cultures of the West, or the global North and the global South. For those with some insight, you may also have noticed the simmering, those of you who may have friends who are Muslims from the Muslim faith, you may have also noticed the simmering frustration in much of the Muslim world with what they perceive to be growing influence and interventionism from Western Western countries. And many of these Muslim nations have a feeling of impotence to do anything about the global export of Western values and Western culture that many Muslims find both reprehensible and threatening to their own values and their own culture. Many of us in the West, those of us here in the US, for example, or Europeans, we often fail to understand something about the Muslim world, and my talk is going to be about our experience in the Muslim world. Many of us in the West fail to understand that most Muslims are poor. And on top of widespread poverty, many Muslims live in strife and crisis-ridden regions of the world. And even before the Syria crisis some years ago, 70% of the world's refugees were Muslim. And of course, during the Syria crisis, that number jumped up significantly. And you may or may not be aware, but with the Syria crisis, a world record was set. During the Syria crisis, we saw the largest displacement of humanity in recorded history. And I think this is something that those of us in the church, perhaps the church responded quite a bit in Syria, but I'm not sure we fully understood the historical ramifications of what happened there. But as we view the world's brokenness, and as Americans, as we see this, we hear it on the radio, we read it in the newspapers, we see it on televisions, I think that our own brokenness as Americans is reflected by our all too common response of confusion and fear to what we see in the Muslim world. And this brokenness at home, our own brokenness, is no better reflected than in the response of many churches, many American Christians at large. Often our response has been a rhetoric of distrust, a rhetoric of disdain, and even hate for Muslim people. People for whom we as Christians supposedly believe that Jesus gave his life for. Yet we respond to them with disdain, with hate, and with fear. I've been asked to share a portion of our family's story while serving with an organization called World Vision. Some of you may know of World Vision. That's the organization I work for. And this was during the time that we were serving with World Vision in the Islamic Republic of Mauritania. You can move to slide 2 here. And this was during the events of 9/11. And I hope that in some small way, this will help us see, our story can help all of us to see Muslims as perhaps God sees them, and to help us see that God really is still at work in the world to reconcile people to himself, even the most broken, even the most wicked. My wife and I, my wife Helene, who is in the back and who is with me, we were married in the mid-1980s. We met each other in the Republic of Niger, which is also a country in the African Sahara Desert. We met in the mid-1980s and were married, and we spent some 15 plus years working in Muslim countries of the Middle East and in Africa. And we chose as our standard Psalm 57, 9, and 10. You may know those passages. I will give thanks to you, O Lord, among the people. I will sing praises to you among the nations. For your steadfast love is great to the heavens and your faithfulness to the clouds. Now, I'm going to be throwing in a lot of disclaimers here. We had a heart and a passion to work among Muslim people. Christians have I was talking over dinner with one of my friends who was talking about how passionate they were about their work. And, you know, we have a way of getting passionate about the things we feel God calls us to. And I think that's good. And my wife and I were passionate about working among Muslim people. But I want to say this, that when we started, we did not have it all dialed in. We made many, many serious mistakes as we tried to love and work among Muslim people. It took time. God had to pull off layers from us. We were sincere. I'm going to tell a story about my wife. So it's easier for me to tell about her missteps than my missteps. And if you talk to her after the service, she will be glad to fill you up on my missteps. But I'm going to tell you one of her missteps. Now, we were living in the Middle East, and I was a professor at the local university there, all Muslim university. There was a mosque on campus, and unlike a Christian university here in the States where the students go to chapel, there they go to mosque. Every morning, the entire 2,000 student body gets together, goes to the mosque and pray. And it was a wonderful opportunity to be salt and light in a place where the gospel is rarely heard. A very difficult time, very hard time, very, very challenging as believers who wanted to share the love of Christ. And my wife was very, very bold. In fact, foreigners were not allowed to go to the dorms. As a professor, I had students. I could lecture students in the classrooms, but I was not supposed to socialize with students and certainly could not go into the dorm. My wife, to my utter horror at the time, would put on a black chador. You know the chador, the full cover, black covering that the women put on? And she would sneak into the dorms with her Bible in her purse and go and share with some of the young women some of my students that she had met. And I used to think, before sunrise, we're both going to be locked up somewhere. But amazingly, God protected her. But when we first got to this country, this was the Sultanate of Oman in the Arabian Peninsula. To honor the local culture, my wife in Muslim countries, if she goes out of the house, she covers up her head with a scarf. She wears a scarf. And it's the right thing to do. But my wife is an artist. My wife loves color. And she made up her mind that she was not going to settle for the normal black or even white headscarf. So she asked me to take her off to the market. We're walking around the marketplace. We passed this stall with all this beautiful colored cloth. And she goes right in. And instantly her eyes land on a piece of cloth about the size of a scarf, maybe a little bit longer, but it would do. And she points to it and tells the man, "I want that piece of cloth." And his eyes kind of get wide and he says, "Well, madam, maybe you want to look at another piece of cloth somewhere else." She said, No, I want that piece of cloth. I just stood outside. I was not getting involved. She won the argument. She paid for this and went home. And for the next 3 months, every time she went out, she wore this scarf of many colors. It was like Joseph's coat, I guess. It was had bright reds, purples, yellows in it, and some tassels on the end. And I well remember we went into this restaurant, an Omani restaurant, a local restaurant, to get some lunch one day, and she had the scarf on. And in that restaurant, all the men ate at the lower level, and the women and the children would eat at the higher level. And you walk in at the lower level, and since I was with my wife, we were going to go up to the next level. But as we walked through the lower level where all these men were seated, actually there was no seats, there were old carpets on the floor sitting around their bowls of rice and stew. Instantly, all of these men stood to their feet. And as we walked by, one of the men politely bowed to Helen and said, "Madam, thank you for trying." Well, I knew that something was amiss here. And finally, after 3 months of begging my wife to retire this colorful artistic head covering and just get a black or a white scarf, she finally did. A few weeks later, I was going up into the mountains. I was working with farmers, doing some research with them with the university. And I had my assistant who was from that country. His name was Abdullah. And I worked with a couple, a family on their farm doing research, monitoring some of what they were doing. And my wife had met this couple, a delightful farm couple up in the mountains. And she said, "You know, Ray, why don't you?" And she went and she pulled off this colorful scarf and she gave it to me. She said, "Why don't you give it to Rashid's wife?" Rashid was the farmer. And I said, "Sure, I'll be glad to." So when I got in the vehicle to drive up, I turned to my assistant, Abdullah. I said, "Oh, Abdullah, my wife has a gift for Rashid's wife. Would you please pass this on to her sometime today when we're up there?" And he looked at it, he said, "Oh, you mean this is a gift for Rashid?" I said, No, this is a gift for Rashid's wife." He goes, "Oh, I don't think you want to give it to Rashid's wife." I said, "Well, why?" He said, "Well, Ray, Mr. Norman, this is a very, very expensive men's loincloth. This is men's underwear. This is what Omani men wear for underwear." You know, I knew something was amiss. Now, tell me, if you were a giant down here, all right, and you saw an Arabic woman who was obviously Arabic with her long flowing robe walking around wearing a pair of boxers on her head, how would you treat her? You know, the Omanis were so generous to my wife. "Madam, thank you for trying." Would we be that gracious? No, we just walk off and say, "Whoa, that woman, someone needs to take that woman to the asylum somewhere." So all that said, at my wife's expense, we didn't have it all dialed in. We were very imperfect people when we set out on this journey. We wrestled with how to live out our lives as Christians in these very, very restricted contexts where no open witness is allowed. And we ask ourselves, how can we be a faithful presence for Christ? Perhaps another way to frame it is, how do we live our lives in a way that gently provokes the questions for which Jesus is the answer? Because that's really the only way to share the love of Christ in these restricted places. Over the years, God had to slowly peel away layers of cultural ignorance, of spiritual arrogance, of prejudice in our lives that hindered the ready flow of Christ's passion for all peoples. We found Muslims to be people with hopes and fears and dreams and aspirations, just like you and me. And we grew to love them. You can go move on to the next slide here. We grew to love these people. And we learned to read 1 Peter 3:15. Some of you may know 1 Peter 3:15. We learned to read 1 Peter 3:15 a little bit more carefully. When we think of 1 Peter 3:15, we usually think of the first part. Always be prepared to make a defense to anyone who asks you for a reason for the hope that is in you. Always be prepared to articulate the hope that is within you when you're asked. But we often fail to remember the second half of 1 Peter 3:15. Peter goes on to say, "But do this, yet do this, with gentleness and respect. Do this with gentleness and respect. Perhaps the most important thing that we learned during those early years is that we learned to love with a love that was beyond ourselves. We also learned the important lesson of learning to receive from those we were called to serve. Because it's very easy to go to these countries thinking, well, I have the gospel, I've got everything to share and give. I have nothing to receive from these people. These people are in darkness and ignorance. They need the gospel. They need the light of the gospel. So I've got everything to give. I have nothing to receive. But we learned the important lesson of learning to receive and to be loved by those that God had called us to serve. And we learned to allow ourselves to be transformed by that. When we moved to Mauritania, which is a desperately poor country in the Western Sahara, it's where the Sahara Desert drops into the Atlantic Ocean. It's just south of Morocco. Mauritania means land of the Moors. The Moors at one point, back when was it? The 1600s, took over the southern part of Europe, took over Spain. Those were the Mauritanians. Today, it's a desperately poor country in the Western Sahara, and we moved there in 1999, where I was leading World Vision's program. I led a team of about 170 staff. About 10 of those were expatriate Christians, just like you and me. The rest of them were Muslim staff. These were truck drivers, these were agricultural agents. So we had a very large program, but most of our staff were Muslims from that country. We did good work among the poor. We were the largest humanitarian agency working in this country. But we often found ourselves in those early years wrestling with the question, and this was it: are we just doing good work? Are we just doing good work among the poor, or are we tangibly demonstrating the love of Christ? Is the love of Christ being seen through what we're doing, through this good humanitarian work? And this question really consumed us. And myself and my senior leadership team, the 10 of us, we spent a lot of time in prayer, a lot of time in intercession, lifting this question up to God. Then on September 11th of 2001, as most of you did who remember that time, we witnessed the Twin Towers fall and we saw the terrorist acts of Al-Qaeda. And being in an Islamic Republic, our staff and myself, we were shocked at what we saw, but we were not surprised. We were keenly aware that poverty lends itself to desperation, and it's a breeding ground for radical acts. Moreover, we also knew that few in the US or in Europe really understood how pervasive choking poverty is in much of the Muslim world. Things were very tense in Mauritania after 9/11. Tight security measures were set in place. We were all in lockdown. There was guards, military guards were sent to our homes, to my daughter's school, to the World Vision offices. It was a very, very tense situation. There were elements in the country that were in favor, that supported the acts of 9/11, but that was certainly not the majority of the people. And I remember on September 12th, going into my office, and I was utterly shocked. I got in there at 8 o'clock in the morning. There was already a line of visitors. These were civic leaders. These were neighbors. These were people from the government. These were Mauritanians coming to apologize for the acts of their fellow Muslims on September 11th. Many of these people came to my office in tears, saying, please don't associate these acts of Al-Qaeda with all Muslim people. And I was deeply, deeply touched. When the restrictions were finally lifted somewhat about 5 weeks later. It was announced by the American embassy, by the French embassy, that we could relax measures and move about town a little bit more freely, a little bit more safely. My wife had to travel. She had a business in Europe, so she was off in Europe, and my son was at boarding school in the neighboring country, and I was there alone with my daughter Hannah. About 5 weeks after 9/11. And since we had been in lockdown, she had only been able to go to her school and back to the house. We lived near the beach, and in Mauritania, where the Sahara drops into the ocean, we had 400 kilometers of empty beach. And it was really one of the few respites you could have in a very, very harsh environment. So I asked Hannah, I said, Hannah, would you like to go to the beach? And of course, today we have an argument about that. I claim that she wanted to go to the beach, and she says, no, Daddy, it was you that wanted to go to the beach. But I was just trying to be a good dad and get her outside after school. So I went and picked her up from the school, and we headed out to the beach about 15 kilometers out of town. And it was our first time in 5 to 6 weeks that we had really been anywhere. And as you approach, it was about 15 kilometers out of town where we usually went, and it's over some low-lying sand dunes in the desert. And then just before you reach the beach, the sand dunes get 50 to 60 feet high, and you have to shift your vehicle into four-wheel drive to get it over those dunes and then to reach the beach. And I pulled up to below one of these large sand dunes, and the windows were up. It was a hot day. My daughter was sitting in the passenger seat beside me, and I got out of the truck to shift the front hubs into four-wheel drive. And as I was shifting down on my knees, shifting the hubs on the front wheels, I heard someone, and I looked up, and a Mauritanian approached me. He was dressed in a long flowing robe. He had a turban on his typical garb. All you could see were the slits of his eyes. And he came up to me and greeted me. And he started out speaking in Arabic, and in Arab customs, greetings are very important. So he came up to me, he said, how do you do? I said, I'm fine. How do you do? He said, I'm well. How are your wives? How are your camels? I said, I'm fine. My wives and my camels are fine. And we exchanged this long greeting, which is very, very, very important in a respectful society. And once we each ascertained that our wives and camels were fine, he moved on to something else. And he said, well, where are you going? And I suspected he wanted to ride into town. And I said, oh, my daughter and I are going out to spend some time on the beach. He then looked at the logo, the World Vision logo on the front of the vehicle. And let's see, you can move to the next slide there. I'm not sure if that vehicle has the logo. Well, you can't see it there, but there is a logo on the side of the vehicle that says World Vision, just like in the top corner that you saw in an earlier slide. And he said, are you American? And I said, well, yes, I am. I didn't think anything of it at that point. I thought nothing of it. I thought he was just being curious. And so he turned to leave, and I went back down to turn the hubs on finish adjusting the hubs on the wheel. And I heard him again, and I stood up, and he had taken 3 paces and turned around. And when I stood up, he was facing me with a 9mm pistol aimed at my chest. Everything flew together very quickly right then. I realized that he had been killing time. He was finding out who I was. He found out that I was an American. And of course, I tried instantly to engage him in conversation. Now, we were just out of view of my daughter. My daughter was playing with the rear view mirror, wasn't paying much attention to us. So she did not see this as she was sitting in the passenger seat. And I tried to engage him. This all took place in a matter of split seconds, and he said nothing. And then I watched as he slowly began to pull the trigger. And at that instant, it dawned on me that I was probably not going to survive this. But if my daughter could survive, that was all that was important. And as he began squeezing the trigger, I ducked, which startled him, and I lunged for the vehicle and threw myself into the front seat and slammed the door. Now, when the commotion, making that commotion, that startled my daughter out of her reverie. And I said, Hannah, get down, get down. And I tried shoving her to the floor of the car. And as I did that, she screamed. She said, Daddy, that man has a gun. And I turned around and he was at the window again with the gun. When my wife and I went to live abroad to try to follow God's call in our lives, we tried to count the costs. We realized that the kind of work that God was calling us to had its risks. And I think we really thought through this. We understood the potential risks. But I am personally a firm believer that we should not ask our children to sacrifice their lives on the altar that God has called us to. Now, that's a hard one to balance because your kids are with you as you're following God's call. But as much as we could, we tried to protect them from the stresses and the strains and the risks of the kind of work we did. So as Hannah started to scream, I turned and the man was right there with the gun, and he had it aimed right at my temple, right next to the glass of the window. And I had hoped to get in and slam the car into first gear to pull away before this, but I knew then that I was gone. And he pulled the trigger and he fired 3 times. Click, click, click. And those 3 times, that 9mm pistol misfired. And all I could think is, it only gave me a split second, but maybe I could still save Hannah. Of course, Hannah was on the floor screaming at this time. And because she was screaming, he took the misfired gun, he tapped it twice, and he turned his aim to her. Now, all of this, my friends, from the beginning to the end, took place in about 5 or 6 seconds. And he took aim at her. And I knew at that point that I had to do something. So I threw myself up against the window. I put my chest up against the glass and my arms, and he fired the 4th shot and it went off. And it came bursting through the window. It came bursting through my arm. And the glass went everywhere. I heard Hannah thump against, in the chaos, thump against the far door. And because when he did that, the glass shattered, but it didn't all fall, he couldn't quite get us in his sights for the next shot. And in that split second, I slammed the car into first gear and spun off. And he took the next shot and it missed my head by a couple of inches. It hit the back headrest, and then he took out the back windows. And so we were flying across the sand dunes, and I knew that I was seriously hurt, but I had a bullet hole that went in here and came out here, but that I would probably survive. And I was just feeling gratitude that maybe we had gotten out okay. And I kept my head down as far as I could until I was sure I was outside of firing range. And when I thought I was outside of firing range, I turned around to see if he had a vehicle or was trying to pursue, and there was no one following us. And it was then, still driving, that I turned my attention to Hannah, because I knew that she was traumatized by this chaos. And I suspected that she had gotten glass under her skin or in her eyes. And I turned my attention to Hannah and I started to say, Hannah, are you okay? When I turned, that was when my world fell apart. Hannah was curled up in the seat, her little hand clutching her chest, and the seat was quickly filling with blood. And I very quietly reached over and pulled Hannah's hand down to see what what she was clutching. And there was a 1.5 inch wide bullet hole in the center of her chest. My friends, my world fell apart. And I cried out to God. I said, God, this is not the way it was supposed to be. You asked me to come and live my life out among these people. And Lord, I'm willing to lay down my life if that's what you asked me to do, but not my daughter. I had a bit of an argument there with my Heavenly Father. I said, Lord, don't make her pay the price for the call that you put on my life. When I pulled, my daughter was at the time was wearing a bathing suit with a summer dress over my modest dress over the bathing suit. When I pulled the front down to look at the wound in her chest, she started to look down. And as a father, I said, Hannah, don't look. Well, when you tell a 10-year-old not to look at something like that, what are they going to do? It makes them all the more curious. So she looked down. And she she stared for a long time at this hole, and blood was pumping out of the hole. And she said, Daddy, have I been shot? I said, yes, Hannah, you've been shot. And she said, very quietly, she said, well, am I about to die now? And something rose up within me. For all I knew, I suspected that the bullet had gone through her lungs and probably had penetrated her heart. It was right over her heart. I expected her, those of you who may be medical people, I expected her to start coughing up blood because the bullet had surely pierced her lungs. And she said, well, Daddy, I'm about to die right now. And I had to say something. And something just rose up within me. And I said, Hannah, you are not going to die right now. And as I said that, she looked up at me. And it was the first time that she realized that I had been shot. And I was by that time completely covered in blood. And I had pieces of muscle, loose muscle hanging out of my arm. And that actually frightened her worse than her own wound. She said, Daddy, have you been shot? I said, yes, I have. She says, well, Daddy, are you about to die now? I said, Hannah, listen, God's going to get us out of this. I said, I tell you what, let me do the driving and you do the praying, and together we'll get out of this. And she said, okay, Daddy, I'll do that. And my little 10-year-old daughter started praying, and there was only one word in her prayer, and it was Jesus, Jesus, Jesus. And she called on that name for the next 20 minutes as I tried to get us back into town. I was not certain. I did not know if there was going to be other attacks in the town. I did not know if this was a concerted effort. I knew nothing. And I managed to get her back into town. But the problem was this, that is, in this country, there was no medical facilities like we have here. There's no emergency rooms. The nearest emergency facility was in the neighboring country, 700 miles distance. And if she had a bullet lodged in her heart or in her lungs, there was nothing anyone could do. Fast forward, I got her into town. She was still lucid. She was still awake. I was worried about losing blood, getting back to getting back into town. And I managed to get my cell phone, and I called my office. I told them there was a doctor who had an office behind our offices. I explained the emergency. I said, I know we can't do surgery, but can you have the doctor meet us? And she did when we got to town. And I remember when we pulled up, Hannah and I pulled up, and all the windows had been shot out of the vehicle. It was not a pretty sight. And by that time, Hannah was starting to fade, and the doctor leaned over Hannah, and I pointed to her chest, and she pulled down the front of her dress. And before Hannah could look, that doctor took one look at that hole, and she turned to me and she whispered, she said, there's no way. Ray, there's no hope. And I put my head down on the wheel of the vehicle, on the steering wheel, and I prayed again. I said, Lord, take my life, but give me my daughter. There was a functioning x-ray machine in the country, and we were able to get her there, and we put her under it. And we waited a tense 15 minutes for it to be developed. And to our amazement, we cannot find any bullet in her chest area. But we did find a bullet down here by her waist. And we were scratching our heads, and a curious bystander started ruffling around in the folds of her dress and pulled out the bullet. And to our utter astonishment, what had happened was when the bullet had come through the window and through my arm, it had sufficiently slowed down so that when it hit her sternum, it ricocheted off her sternum, went across her rib cage, and came out in her armpit and had dropped into the folds of her dress. And suddenly I realized Hannah was not in mortal danger. She was still very seriously wounded. She had a hemorrhage on her lungs. The impact had hemorrhaged her lungs, but she was going to survive. He is faithful. God is faithful. There's a lot of things we don't always understand. But in the midst of the hardest of situations, he is faithful. Even in loss, he is faithful. But God gave me my daughter at that moment. By that time, there was about 400 local Muslims around this small clinic because they had heard the story and wanted to know what had happened to this foreigner and to his daughter who had been shot. We were medevaced. World Vision flew in an ambulatory plane that night. This had happened about 4 or 5 o'clock in the afternoon. Around midnight, the plane arrived. We were medevaced to the Children's Hospital in Paris, and Hannah went through surgery and spent 2 weeks there. So here was the big question for us. My daughter had been saved, and we met up with my wife back in France. And we were in the Central Children's Hospital in Paris. We knew that God had given us our daughter, but the question was, what do we do with our program in Mauritania? We were the largest humanitarian organization. We worked with tens of thousands of the poorest of the poor, the most vulnerable people in this country. We had, during the previous Iraq war, we had to shut down our operations. And my office, my phone was ringing left and right saying, Ray, you need to shut down the program, get your people out. And in the midst of just trying to focus on my wife and my daughter and my son and the trauma we had at hand, I was also trying to think about our witness to these people. You see, here was the question that gnawed at me. When we do rural development, we go into these communities and we say to these poor people, we are here to walk with you on this journey out of poverty. We are here to help. We're not coming as your savior, but we're here to get down in the gutter with you and hold your hand and walk with you out of poverty and into a place of hope. And we ask it, World Vision will only work in the community if we can be there for 10 to 15 years. It's a long-term commitment. And these communities had agreed to work with us. So what type of testimony would it be when we say, well, you're vulnerable, we're coming here to help you, we want to walk with you, and then suddenly when we become vulnerable, what do? Pack up our bags and go home? That was the question. What kind of witness for Christ would that have been? We were there to try to find a way to let these people know that they are of value to God, vulnerable as they are, that God loves them. And then when I become vulnerable, I pack my bags and go home. I just could not do that. I really struggled. And my wife, it was the most courageous thing I've ever seen her do. My wife agreed that we needed to go home. We prayed and prayed and prayed. And you know, dusty and dirty and filthy as that country was, it was our home. It's the place we loved. We had neighbors there. We had friends there. My daughter's school was there. And dangerous and risky as it was, we chose to go back. It was a hard decision. For me as a husband, I was wrestling with the issue, well, there's no churches there. There's no community like you have here. How is my wife and my daughter, how are they going to be emotionally restored? Who's going to help them through this trauma? Who's going to walk with them on this journey? Lord, how is real healing going to come to our family in this remote outpost? And I remember well, flying back that night, we arrived in the capital city. Our little plane bumped into the runway, and at that time you had to walk across the tarmac to the little arrival building. And as we got off the plane in the darkness of that desert night, I remember stepping off saying, Lord, you've got to do something, because we're obeying you, but we're coming back into the wilderness. How will you bring healing to my family? And immediately I began to see God's answer. As we stepped off that plane into the darkness, suddenly coming towards us across the tarmac were 5 large Arabic men dressed in robes and turbans, only the slits of their eyes showing, looking exactly like the assailant we had seen some weeks ago. They come striding out of the darkness, saying nothing. And Hannah is instantly terrified. She grabs my hand, wanting to know who these men are. And before I could do anything, one of them steps out, grabs Hannah off of her feet, and begins to kiss her. And it was only then that I saw the tears in these men's eyes. These were our Muslim staff who had traveled hundreds of kilometers across the desert. World Vision Muslim staff coming to welcome my daughter home. And they hugged her and they kissed her and they said, Hannah, thank you for having the courage to come home. Welcome home. God began to heal my daughter's heart through the love of these Muslim men. A few days later, we worked in a very, very poor shanty town on the edge of town. We worked all over the country, but in the capital city, we worked in a very large shanty town, over 1 million people living in tin and cardboard homes. And we received a letter. We received a very crumpled note written in Arabic from the Women's Association where we did work. We pulled the women together. We worked with them. We tried to help them. And the head of the Women's Association from this shanty town called Arafat had written a note to my wife and said, Mrs. Norman, we would like you to come out 2 days hence and spend the afternoon with us. We'd like to host you. Well, my wife had never received anything like that. She looked at it and she said, well, sure, I'll be glad to come out. Not knowing what it was, not knowing what was happening. And so that afternoon, she goes out in a World Vision vehicle and they drop her off at this place. And when she arrives, they've erected a large Bedouin tent on the sand dunes. And there's about 60 women, and these are the poorest of the poor, dressed in rags. But they are clapping and singing and dancing and spinning around as my wife comes up, celebrating, and she's obviously the guest of honor. I was not there. I learned all this from my wife later. And they take her into the tent and they sing some more, and they fixed her food, and they bring her this lovely local dish and feed her dates and fruit. And the whole time my wife is saying, well, this is very nice, but what's this all about? And finally the singing and the dancing slows down, and the matriarch, the lady, stands up and she says, Mrs. Norman, you're probably wondering why we invited you here. Yes, we are grateful for the work of World Vision. World Vision has transformed our community. We're so grateful for the opportunity as women to come together and work for the betterment of the community. But that's not the reason we invited you here. First of all, Mrs. Norman, we thank God, we thank Allah that He spared your husband and your daughter's life. But Mrs. Norman, we are women And we understand the wounds of a mother's heart. We understand the wounds of a wife's heart. We know that the bullets hit your husband and your daughter. They didn't hit you. But we know that your own wounds must run deep. We brought you here to let you know something, that you are not on this journey alone. We are here with you on your journey of recovery, to love you, to support you. And as those words sank in, suddenly a woman jumped up and stood Helen to her feet and began wrapping her in this beautiful Mauritanian robe, something that she herself could never afford. Other women jumped up and came and started putting necklaces around her neck and rings on her finger, bracelets around, giving out of their poverty to meet the needs of my broken wife. This is an example of the Imago Dei. These women are created in God's image, just like you and me. They may be Muslim, but they are created in God's image, and they are endowed with the same capacity to love that you and I have. Desperately poor Muslim women, richly endowed with the capacity to love. And it was then that God began to heal my wife's heart. We were in a place where there was no church community. There was no pastors, no elders, no brothers or sisters to turn to. And God used, in incredible ways, our Muslim friends to strengthen us. But things were still difficult. The American Embassy received an anonymous phone call that said, we did not get the World Vision director, but the next time we will not make the same mistake. So I was still at risk. I had to go around with guards. The president of the country assigned his director of national security to accompany me whenever I left the home. It was very difficult to get our work done. And I was still getting calls saying, Ray, you need to shut it down, bring people, bring your staff home because this is too risky. But I didn't feel that we could leave these communities that God had called us to help. And I was on the phone with my own pastors. I remember one pastor saying to me, Ray, you and Helen have been working in Muslim countries for 17 years. It's time to come home and recover. And this is a man that I deeply loved and deeply respected and in some measure was accountable to. And I was deeply conflicted. It was hard. And I remember one night, about 3 o'clock in the morning, there's many nights I laid awake till 3 o'clock trying to decide what to do. And I was praying and I suddenly had this idea. And I decided that I would see if the leading Muslim cleric would give me an audience. I had never met this man. This is the leading Muslim imam for the country. I got to my office the next day. I asked my staff, I said, could you see if Imam Hamdan would be willing to give me an audience? And they said, well, we can try. And 2 days later, I received a telephone call. They said, the Imam has agreed to give you an audience. Moreover, he's coming here today at 9 o'clock. Well, I was utterly shocked that the Imam, the leading Islamic cleric, would come to the World Vision office. And I called the mosque and I said, please tell the Imam that I will gladly come and see him. He doesn't have to come here. They said, nope, the Imam told us he's coming to see you there. It's better not to ask any questions. And so at 9 o'clock, he comes up, he's a very old fellow. And 2 men are helping him up the stairs and he's got a long white robe, a large white turban and a very long white beard, came down below his waist, looking like a classic Islamic imam. And he sat down and after our formalities, I said, sir, the reason I asked this audience with you is I have a very difficult decision to make. And I was wondering if you would give me some wisdom. May I ask you some advice? He didn't say a word, he just nodded. And I said, sir, as you know, we are a Christian organization working in vulnerable Muslim communities in your country. And you know what happened during the events of 9/11. You know the tensions that have been happening. You know the risk involved. You also are aware that myself and my daughter were attacked. And I said, my people are telling me to shut down the program and go home. And I said, but I'm conflicted. I said, would you give me your advice? And the imam looked at me and he said, he cleared his throat and very slowly spoke. He said, Mr. Norman, I have three things to say to you. He said, the first is, I commend World Vision. I commend you. Your work is very professional. You do good work in our poor communities. He said, the second thing is you bring a sense of order. When you come into our disparate communities, you bring a real sense of cohesion and order, which the community needs. And I commend you for that. And then he leaned across the coffee table and he pointed something very rude in that culture. And he pointed right in my face and shook a finger. He said, but Mr. Norman, there's a third thing that I don't think you understand. And I knew exactly what he was going to say. But you are Christians, we are Muslims, we are not compatible. You need to pack your bags and go home. I was certain that was the third thing. He said, Mr. Norman, there's a third thing that I don't think you understand. And he said, we Muslims give to the poor because in Islam, we are commanded to. It's an order. But you people at World Vision, you Christians, you work with the poor because you love the poor. If for no other reason, please stay in this country and teach our people how to love their poor. My team and I every day had been praying before 9/11, Lord, is all this humanitarian work just good humanitarian work? Or is the love of Christ being shown? And here is the leading Islamic cleric shaking a finger in my face saying, you people work with the poor because you love the poor. Teach us how to do that. And my friends, doors of opportunity flung open. I got on the phone and called the international president, who at that time his office was in California, because he was wanting to know if we were going to keep the doors open or closed. I called him up and his name was Dean Hirsch. I said, sir, we're keeping the operations going. We are staying. The Holy Spirit just spoke to me through an imam. I did. I said that to him. Because the Holy Spirit had spoken to me through the words of an imam. And so we decided to stay, and God began to open incredible doors of opportunity. Questions were provoked by this. You're at risk. Why are you staying here? What compels you to stay and work among us? The questions for which Jesus is the answer were being provoked. I need to wrap this up here, but a few weeks later, we learned that the assailant had been caught. And we also learned that because he came from a very prominent family in the country, he was a very well-educated man. He came from a very prominent clan, but he had brought shame to them because of what he had done. We learned informally that he was probably going to conveniently disappear before his case ever came to court. And I was sitting at the table with my wife discussing this, and because our kids were at the table, I was trying to say it in bits and pieces, you know, when the kids were occupied talking to themselves, and explain what I had heard. And Hannah somehow got wind of what I was saying. And she was mortified. She said, well, Daddy, you can't let that happen. And I turned to my wife for an answer to what I tell my daughter. And my wife looked at me. She says, Ray, you can't let that happen. And I said, what am I supposed to do about this? She said, Ray, we can't. Both Hannah and Helen said to me, Ray, over the dinner table, we can't let it happen. And I said, what do you want me to do? And so Helen says, we need to go see this man. I said, Helen, he's prisoner number one in the country. They're not going to let us get within a mile of this guy. And then my daughter piped up. She said, yes, Daddy, we need to go see this man. Well, I was flummoxed. I just, what do you do? And so to please my wife and my daughter, the next day I get on the phone. I had this security system from the director of national security. So I had his personal phone number and I had to check in with him every day. And so when I had my daily check-in with him, I said, sir, I've got a request of you. And he said, yes, Mr. Norman, what can I do for you? I said, well, and I'm going to tell the truth here. I said, well, I have a request from my wife and my daughter. I made it clear it wasn't my request. He said, well, this is interesting. What can I do for your wife, your daughter? I said, they would like to meet the assailant. There was a long silence on the phone. And then he finally cleared his throat. And then he let out a nervous chuckle. And then he said, that's the most ridiculous thing I have ever heard. I said, well, I said, sir, look at it this way. It's part of their restoration. They feel they need to see this man. Could you please see? He said, well, I'll look into it. He said, but don't get your hopes up. And every week I would call him for 4 months. And he said, Ray, it's not going to happen. And then suddenly, 4 months later, my phone rings and it's the director of national security. He said, Mr. Norman, I don't know what happened, but the president has given you permission to visit the prisoner, but you have to be down at the prison in half an hour. I ran out of the office. I jumped into my vehicle, went to get Helen. And I said, Helen, we've got a half an hour to get to the prison. They said we'll have 5 minutes with the prisoner. And we felt we had to stop by the school. We needed to tell Hannah this would have happened, but I did not expect her, nor did I want her to go to the prison. And we went to the school. The principal brought her out. And I said, Hannah, Mom and Dad are going to go see the prisoner. We got permission. I wanted you to know. She said, I'm going. I said, Hannah, you don't need to go. It's not a very pleasant. Daddy, I'm going. So my daughter, my wife and I, we were in this long entourage with the American embassy. There was a CIA agent at one end. There was the director of national security. It was about a caravan of 6 vehicles. We wound our way out to the edge of town to this horrific edifice, which is the men's national prison. And they ushered us in and they took us into this large room. It was almost as long as the width of this room, maybe a little bit shorter. And they sat us down on one end and there was a single chair up against the other wall. And they said, we're going to bring the prisoner in from the side. We're going to seat him there. Do not leave your chairs. Do not get up. Do not approach the prisoner. And you can speak to him across the room. You have 5 minutes. I was thinking, what has my wife got me into now? What has my daughter got me into? And we had not coached Hannah on anything. I thought she was just going to observe. So they brought the prisoner in, and obviously he had not been forewarned. When he took one look at us, he was instantly quite agitated, and it was clear he was sure we were going to bring him grief and misery. And it was very chaotic in there. The guards were all talking and carrying on. And so I stood up, and with a very loud voice, I said, Mr. Ali, that was his name. I said, Mr. Ali, I want you to know we are not here to accuse you or bring you grief. I said, the reason we are here is because my wife and daughter want to ask you a question or two. I did. I said, is that okay? Well, what could he have said? So he kind of nodded and, nobody knew what was happening. And because I said that, everyone else, there was about 50 people in the room or 30 at least, armed guards. Everyone quieted down. So I turned to Hannah. I said, Hannah, do you want to say something to Mr. Ali? And again, we had never coached her. We didn't even think she was coming. She said, yes, I do. And my 10-year-old daughter stood up. And she looked across that room. She said, Mr. Ali, I have two things to say. First, I want to know why you tried to kill my daddy. You could have heard a pin drop. And what was the poor man supposed to say? And I thought he gave a pretty reasoned response. He basically, in a very rambling discourse, basically said, well, with all the anti-American rhetoric on the radio and all this and that, I lost my head. He wanted to be a hero. And I thought, given the circumstances, it was about as reasonable an answer as one could ask for. And my daughter nodded. She said, okay, I understand that. She said, the second thing, Mr. Ali, is I want you to know that I don't have any bitterness in my heart for you, and I forgive you. Well, I just about fell over. Ali, for the first time, got serious, and his mouth dropped open. You see, what we didn't realize is the government in Mauritania is a cross between French civil colonial law and Sharia law. And under Sharia law, no judge, no jury can pardon the attempt on someone's life. It's the death penalty. The only way the death penalty can be pardoned is from the victim or the victim's family. And the next morning, on the Arabic front page, his 10-year-old daughter forgives the assailant. His life was spared. I then turned to my wife. I said, Helen, do you want to say something? And God gave my wife wisdom that I had never seen before. My wife stood up and she said, Mr. Ali, to have inflicted the pain you have on my family, surely you must be someone who's experienced a lot of pain yourself. And he started nodding. And he started recounting stories of hardship in his own life. And my wife said, as they were talking, she said, do you get the papers here in the prison? He says, yes, I'm allowed to read the newspapers. She said, did you read the articles where they were saying that Allah protected my husband when you fired 3 shots at his temple? He said, well, yes, I did. I read that. And maybe perhaps God was protecting your husband. I don't know. She said, Mr. Ali, I think the papers got it wrong. You see, I think when those 3 shots misfired, I think God's attention was focused on you. I think those bullets misfired because God cares about my husband, but God's eyes were on you. God was sparing your life because your life has a hope and still has a purpose and is of value. And this is a country where it is illegal to even bring Christian material into the country, to bring Bibles, very illegal to give them to the local people. And my wife stood up after she said that. And to my horror, she reached into her purse and she pulled out a French Bible. And she walked across that room and stood beside Ali and began reading passages of hope, beginning in Isaiah and finishing in Romans, and explaining to her, to Ali, how a price beyond measure was paid for his life. And when she finished, she closed it. She said, would you like to keep this book? And he snatched it from her hands and he stuck it into his undergarments. And Helen turned to the director of the prison and said, can this man keep this book? And he stiffened up and he said, yes, ma'am, he may keep the book. I thought we were all going to end up in the same cell as Ali that day. And when we walked out of that prison, I was more angry at my wife, and I was more, is it pleased? I don't know what it was. I just couldn't believe this woman. I didn't know what to think. And I finally mumbled, I said, Helen, you took a pretty big risk in there, didn't you? She said, I think I earned the right to do what I did, and I think the authorities saw that. I said, amen, you did. The next day, and I am going to wrap this up here because my time is up. Can we go on to the next slide? And I will explain this in a minute. The next day, we received a letter from Ali from the prison. He said, I cannot find the words to describe our meeting yesterday. Although I still feel remorse with regards to the evil I have caused you, words cannot express the depth of my joy in seeing you with your daughter alive and well. You have demonstrated immense kindness. Many times I have heard of Christian charity, Christian love. I have now seen it. I have now experienced it. And for me, this is a new path which is opening up, a light which shows the way before me, transcending all obstacles which have kept me from the one who is infinitely great.